Hello, I'm Robin, and welcome to Bookspin. Today we're going to talk about Chinese science fiction, and this is something I've been interested in and curious about for a while now. So last year I picked up this book, Sinopticon, a celebration of Chinese science fiction. It's a collection of short fiction in translation from a wide range of modern Chinese authors, and it was published in 2021. I haven't reviewed this book as I first read it before I started this channel, but I can definitely recommend it. It's got an interesting and diverse and thought provoking array of stories. Well worth checking out if you're interested in exploring some sci fi from another culture. So the other day, I had a very interesting chat with Xueting C, who is the editor and translator of this book. And she kindly spared some time with me to discuss her book and Chinese science fiction in general. Right. Today we have Xueting C, who is the editor and translator of Sinopticon, which I've now read twice. I read it last year, and I recently listened to the audiobook, and I really enjoyed it. It's really fantastic collection from a wide range of contemporary Chinese SF writers, and a fascinating glimpse into science fiction from another culture. So thank you, firstly, for spending time for us this evening, and thank you for producing this anthology and introducing me to some new Chinese SF writers, which I'm very pleased to discover.
Thank you, Robin, for reading it and reading it twice, which is I'm super impressed with. And thanks for inviting me. Yeah, I'm really glad you enjoy the stories.
Yeah. So first, I'd like to ask you about Chinese science fiction, and specifically, where does your interest in Chinese science fiction come from, and how did you come up with the idea for Sinopticon?
I think I've always liked SFF. I think it from when I was very little, in terms of sci-fi, kind of watching kind of sci-fi cartoons, to looking through the copies of Russian science fiction that my parents were reading when I was very little. And then I used to browse through Science Fiction World magazines on the newsstands when I visited China, back when they still existed. And then from about the 2010s, I started to, or maybe a bit earlier, I saw this kind of emergence of genre fiction, including science fiction in China, and have really wanted to bring science fiction to English readers since then. And a few years ago, the time was finally right for the market, and I got the opportunity to curate and translate this collection, which is fantastic.
Great. So when you were devising this idea for this anthology, how did you decide which writers you wanted to approach and which stories you wanted to include?
So I was looking at the time span of the last 30 years, which covers the beginning of the new rise of Chinese science fiction, or the Renaissance, from the 1990s. And so I wanted to cover the three generations, broadly speaking, of writers. And I was working with some writers I worked with before, or I met through conventions, and also working with Storycom, the story commercialization agency, who had their own list of authors, and also introduced me to some more writers in the community. So it was a mixture of approaches. So I tried to include, as my aim was to include as wide a range of styles, content, tones as possible.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's definitely got a wide range of styles and tones, as you say, and I think no matter what kind of sci-fi you're into as a reader, you'll find something in there which will you'll appreciate, I think. So I think there's something in there for everyone to enjoy. And I think I enjoyed all of the stories, but there were a couple that stood out for me particular, and I've been thinking about them for a long time since then. And I think that's because they contained particularly intriguing and thought-provoking ideas. So I'd like to ask you about one of the stories, which is the first one in the volume, and it's called The Last Save by Gushu. And in this story, we have a technology available to people which allows people to travel back in time to previous points in their life, which act kind of like checkpoints in a computer game. And I think it was a really interesting idea, kind of this idea that if you make a mistake, if you mess something up, you can just turn back the clock and you can reset it. And that's kind of the premise for the story. But it seems to be the technology in the story has become so widely available that people have forgotten that humanity is what it is because of our flaws and our imperfections, and actually that is quite a dangerous idea that we could actually go back and change the past. At least that's how I interpreted that story. So I'd like to ask you, is there any particular reason you chose this story, The Last Save, as the opener for Sinopticon?
Yes, it was mainly because the story I thought it was very accessible as a first story to introduce people into the collection. There's not been many Chinese SF collections, so it's a relatively new tradition to the Anglophone readership. So something that is about the everyday, is about one piece of technology and the effect of that, the effect that has on a world that we are familiar with otherwise, is quite a good way of introducing readers into the and it's about the even though this technology has a great impact, the story is kind of rooted in the everyday life of this of the protagonist. So it's a great way of easing people into the collection, and I think the character is very identifiable. I mean, we've all been there. We've all wanted to. What if we could redo this exam or this driving test, or this reorganize this party again to make it go better? You know, we've all felt like that. But what if you can do that endlessly, and particularly for the Chinese society, with their kind of obsession with learning and technology and achieving, that gets taken to the extreme. And there's a bit where the character thinks back to having to take his exams. You know, his teacher's asking him to take his exam, and he refusing to because he just gets fed up with like having to retake them to achieve the perfect one. But yeah, what if that very universal kind of feeling of, oh, what if we can redo this to make it better, gets taken to the extreme? But the story is very much about the everyday life of protagonist, who I always had a feeling was a bit like an Adrian Mole type character. You know, he's in his 30s. He's not too happy with his life. He's a bit grumpy and feels like he can't do much about it, but he wants to, and then he reflects on it and then changes his decisions in the end. And then there is the rather comical relationship with his wife's dog, who kind of so yeah. So I picked it because it's fantastically written, integrating the sci-fi into the story very well, and also it's very accessible.
Yeah, I think it was a good choice. And there's another story which that stood out to me that I think I ought to mention. It's called The Absolution Experiment by Bao Shu, who I've talked about this story on a previous video, and it's quite a short one. It's very dark, and it's immortality is a key theme. And but I think one thing that interested me about it, it has perhaps the least sympathetic protagonist I've ever read in a short story. Is a convicted mass murderer, and it's got a great sort of twist at the end. So I think this story was quite different to the others, and that it's very bleak in its tone. But I really liked it, and I was wondering, why did you choose this story for Sinopticon?
First of all, thank you for the wonderful praise of both stories. I hope that will make readers who are new to the collection read these stories and the rest of the book. I'm glad you picked on this. I'm glad you picked this one because it's one that people don't usually choose as their favorites. Yeah, I chose it because it did have a great impact on me when I read it, and it's kind of this very kind of, it's a shocker really. It's a story of great impact, and not only do you have a kind of a protagonist that you're kind of least sympathetic with, but the other main character, in the end, I think our view of this character is very much complicated by when we know the consequences of his actions too. Is he justified? What is justice? The story really looks at, and also some feedback I've got from some readers is that it's quite seems quite a common theme to have this kind of terrorism and then revenge type story. But then I think the unique take from the Chinese sci-fi is the quest for immortality, which has been quite a traditional preoccupation of the Chinese, and I find it really interesting. It's examined really interesting in this story, in a very interesting way in this story.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, because I actually the video that I was referring to that I made quite recently is about immortality in science fiction, and I chose that as one of the stories that I wanted to talk about. So, and yeah, I think you're right, because in immortality was quite a big thing in Taoism, wasn't it, back in the day? Or
Yeah,
the search for immortality. Yeah.
that was the goal of their alchemy, to for immortality, rather than turning stones into things into gold.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, aside from those two stories, were there any other stories within this collection that you particularly enjoyed working on, or particularly enjoyed translating?
I really enjoyed Starship Library. I mean, I enjoyed all the stories. There were some that I enjoyed more than others, but again, this is not a story this is not a collection of my personal favorites. It's there to showcase the range that is out there as possible in one volume. But I loved Starship Library, which is the last story in the collection, because, well, I've always liked witty British sci-fi, like Doctor Who and the Douglas Adams books. So, and I thought this story had a very similar tone. It's epic in that it has a galactic span, but also it's about a lot of things that are humanist. So about reading, about how we learn, and the importance of books, which are, very topical in the book. And it's also quite action-packed in places and very contemplative in other places. So yeah, I really enjoyed translating that and being able to translate the different civilizations that the ship travels to, and the different settings, of course, that the library ends up in. And of course,
yes,
an alternative perspective of a protagonist who is not, I should not spoil it, but yeah, you have kind of a slightly different perspective from the protagonist.
Right, and I if I remember correctly, there was quite an epic scale to that story. I mean, a few of the stories were quite epic in scope, but I did enjoy that one. So yeah.
Well, it was kind of fun, and it was kind of great to start with a story based on the everyday, and then to finish on one that's quite epic, like a space opera type.
Yeah. As someone who's kind of very much involved in the world of Chinese sci-fi, do you think there are any characteristics or themes or motifs or subgenres popular within Chinese science fiction?
At the moment, I think in this decade or so, writers are able to examine their kind of look back into their heritage for the first time in kind of modern history. So they are doing a lot of interesting things with mythology, with classical culture, and reinterpreting them or evolving the lore of it in science fiction. That's really interesting. There are a lot of stories to do with about artificial intelligence, or some of them even written with AI tech companies or with an AI, because the technology is really developing very quickly in China, and it is entering the everyday. Furthermore, kind of, I can see quite a lot of social kind of contemporary preoccupations, for example, kind of the environmental sci-fi, science fiction to do with the Anthropocene impact and ecology. That's kind of, seeking, looking at alternative sources of energy. That's, I think, on the rise. So these are a few themes that I can see.
They kind of all reflect current trends in modern technology, which perhaps they're center of people's concerns.
Yeah, modern
Yeah,
trends and occupations, I think.
yeah,
You're getting some dystopia, of course, because there is people are starting to see the effect of um, mass consumerism, both from the consumer's viewpoint and from the worker's viewpoint. So there is that, and also stories to do with technology, the impact of technology, the bad impacts, and some of the positive uses of technology. Yeah, so these are the themes.
okay.
Yes, I mean, each tradition from each country, from each region is unique in itself.
Yeah.
It is unique in that sense too.
Well, I think I'm going to have to mention Remembrance of Earth's Past, the three-body problem trilogy, because it seems to be almost impossible to have any discussion about Chinese science fiction without mentioning this book and this series. And because this series has been such a big hit, both in China and around the world, the first Chinese book to win a Hugo. And of course, we've got the newest TV adaptations, which have raised its profile. And so I guess my first question is, I mean, I'm making an assumption here. Have you read it?
I have read it, yes.
Did you read the Chinese original or English translation?
I read the Chinese original. I'm sure
Okay.
translations are great.
Okay. So are you a fan? What do you think of his work and his writing style and what he's done to kind of raise the profile of Chinese SF around the world?
I do think it's excellent. I do think it's really great. Um, but I'm someone who likes hard sci-fi as well as soft sci-fi. So I think a lot of I did find, I mean, I did struggle with some of the science in it. Did have to read it a few times to understand it. Uh, but I found it's very well written, perhaps not fantastic in the representation of female characters, but
Right.
it's very well written and has so many fascinating constructs in it in terms of the VR world and in terms of the um, whole situation on Earth and the radio waves and the whole organization to um, so the whole construction is very epic. So I
Yeah.
do like that. I do think it's a quite a monumental um, series of books. So, and I can definitely see its appeal. Yeah. And as you brought up these books, that reminded me of another feature, perhaps that's unique to Chinese science fiction, is that
Oh yeah.
it has been very hard science based up till very recently, and now it's branching off into softer science, and maybe the boundaries are blurring, and there are writers who are integrating the science into the story more rather than focusing on the science concepts themselves in the stories. I think that's a distinct development in Kehuan, which is Chinese for science fiction.
Right. Yeah. I think it's very interesting. Yeah, because Liu Cixin I think he's pretty hard SF in his style, and as you say, some of the science is a bit. It kind of goes over your head a little bit, or at least it did for me. It seems like every single page has a new mind-bending idea, and I really enjoyed it for that purpose. I know he has been criticized for, as you say, he can't do female characters very well. It's been a few years since I've read it. I can't really remember the characterization. All I just remember is the ideas, but I'm planning to reread it later this year. So I'll have to review my opinion then. But I think one of his greatest achievements, I think, is he's kind of opened up the world to Chinese SF, or not just SF, but Chinese literature in general, I think, because for a lot of Western readers, this may be the first thing or the only thing they've read by a Chinese author. And for me, it encouraged me to seek out other Chinese works, including your own collection. But sorry, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm not a science. I don't have a science background. I have a literary background, so a humanities background. So therefore, I did struggle with this science, and I think it's important for science fiction to be accessible. Yeah.
Right. Fair enough. Yeah. Yeah. There are some people who just don't get on with the three-body problem, and I can understand why, especially if you're not so keen on the hard science stuff. But I kind of enjoy it even if I don't understand it. But yeah, I just wanted to say, because one thing I learned, or kind of in my research recently, that Liu Cixin's success in China itself is perhaps even more pronounced than in the West, because I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but his name is kind of almost synonymous with Kehuan, or science fiction. And I recently read that it's estimated that in China, the yearly sales of his books exceed the sum of the yearly sales of all other science fiction books combined. I read that somewhere, and he hasn't actually published a new novel since the Three-Body Problem trilogy, but he's still got that status within China. Quite a monumental achievement.
Yeah. I mean, he has written other books, like there's a cyberpunk novel that he wrote before Three-Body. I think it's one of the first Chinese cyberpunk novels as well.
I've got one of his books here. Don't know if you haven't read it. This one, Ball Lightning.
Ah, right. Yes.
This one.
There's a film coming out as well based on that too. It hasn't come out yet, but I think they're making it. No, it's not one I've read. No.
I've noticed that on some of his books in this Head of Zeus series, they call him Dalio.
Yeah.
Like was it like Great Leo? So I think that's kind of a testament to his status.
A respectful nickname for him in the Chinese sci-fi circle, Chinese SF community. Yeah, I think his impact has been great. In that, in China, he's helped introduce a lot of people who don't read science fiction to read science fiction. So introduce science fiction into the mainstream, because it's been quite niche. I mean, science fiction is still quite relatively niche in the West even, but I think it was even more so in China, in that it was very much the stuff of university societies, PBS forums, and zines and things like that. The fandom kind of arose from that. And it used to be academics that wrote it. But now it's diversified in terms of authorship and readership. And I think that those books have helped. And as I said in my introduction to Sinopticon, people are still a bit, because science fiction has been so attached to, associated with education, that people still get slightly confused in China. And most people think it's some kind of educational book when you ask for science fiction in a bookshop. But when you say Liu Cixin, they understand, it's the epic science fiction stuff.
Right. Okay.
So
yeah.
they get that it's that and not the educational textbooks. So I think that's good. And I think I was on a panel last week and we talked about gateway books. Three Body Trilogy is one of those, where you get this special book that kind of opens the door for people to a genre, for people who don't usually read that genre. But having said that, I think there's a lot beyond Liu Cixin, and I think it's great that every time I mention those two words, three body, Twitter or Instagram gets super excited. There are things beyond Liu Cixin, and part of what I'm trying to do is introduce people to Chinese sci-fi Kehuan beyond that. So
yeah, and I think in your collection you have successfully sort of worked with quite a diverse range of writers of different backgrounds, men and women, different age groups, and professions and what have you. So I think it's a good entry point into learning more about Chinese science fiction. I think the only thing for me is when I've looked up the writers in this volume, and I want to find out more about them, and then I find out some information on Wikipedia, and then it says they've written all of these wonderful novels or stories, and I think, oh great, and then I realize most of them haven't been translated, or half of them haven't been translated to English. so yeah, I'm hoping more people like you and Ken Liu can bring out, do more translations, and bring these books out into the West, because I think there's such a rich source of Chinese sci-fi out there, which we're just it's just beginning to learn about, I think. And as you say, Liu Cixin has opened up the door, but there's a lot more beyond the Three Body Problem series.
Yeah, just to respond to that, I think it's important to have more translators as well as more authors. There are certainly more science fiction being translated, Chinese science fiction being translated into English now. I'm seeing more, for example, Han Song is publishing his hospital trilogy. Clarkswell keep on doing more, keep on translating, getting more sci-fi stories translated. And there are other volumes coming out too. Hao Jingfang has published a book.
Vagabonds,
well.
Yeah. I've read Vagabonds.
Oh, great. Yes. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, so there are more getting published. I think we're definitely
great.
And there needs to be more translators as well. And there are, and that just needs to keep happening.
Well, good. I think that the work you're doing is also encouraging perhaps more people to go into translation as a field, or especially translating Chinese genre fiction. I think that's most of the questions I wanted to ask you. But before we sort of wrap things up, if for anyone who wants to learn more about you and your work, because I know you're not just a translator of sci-fi, you've been writing your own work, and including non-fiction and Chinese myths, and so for anyone who wants to find out more about you and your work, where can they go?
They can go to my website, snowpavilion.co.uk, where I publish regular articles, semi-regularly. I try to keep it up to date. I also publish non-fiction articles on various platforms, but they get updated on my social media, which is Twitter and Instagram. Mainly, Twitter is Xueting C and Instagram is Snow Pavilion. And I have a few books out at the moment, from Kuan Yin to Chairman Mao, which is a cultural, sociological take on the Chinese deities, and then Chinese myths, which is coming up next month, which is all about Chinese mythology. Yeah, then I'm working on a horror collection at the moment to be published next year. So if you like horror, keep an eye out for that. And the other three are Chinese myths will be published next month, and the other one is already published.